Great. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. It's always fun to tell Boulder's story. We always like to think of ourselves as being unique, just like every other city. But in many respects, in this particular area in particular, we are very special in the sense that we have spent many, many decades planning for conservation and biodiversity and are now challenged with sort of the second generation of issues that come from that success. And so it's fun to tell that story. For those of you who don't know Boulder, Colorado, we are a relatively small community in the center of the United States, more or less, right up against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. These numbers are not missing zeros. You'll note that we are substantially smaller than the other cities up here. They are a little disingenuous in the sense that we are part of a much larger urban ecosystem that includes the Denver metropolitan area, that also includes the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, which is about a 1,000 kilometer long ecological transition zone. You'll note that it's not very clear in this particular picture, but I'll draw your attention to the mountains, the mountain backdrop. Those are within the confines of the city. And so when we talk about our ecological transition, it's from semi-arid to subalpine to full alpine. This is a transition of about 8,000 feet over the course of the zone that we're looking at here. You'll also note that a substantial proportion of the city's land area is actually under conservation right now, whether that's through private holdings and easements or whether that is through direct acquisition. We have a very aggressive, very progressive acquisition program that has been in place for nearly 60 years, where the city back in the late 50s and early 60s identified conservation and sort of the backdrop of the mountains as a social benefit and began taxing ourselves. So every good or service bought or sold in the city receives a small tax, and then the city, through a strategic investment plan and planning process, has been actively acquiring land around the city. So we're confined by a green belt that is, unlike some of our colleagues, a very firm boundary for growth, or it has been in most of our history. And so that does have some very interesting pressures in terms of housing affordability, in terms of commercial real estate costs, and those are some of the issues that we're really grappling with at the much larger resilient scale. It's an interesting transition, or it's an interesting connection to draw between biodiversity and housing affordability, but in fact that's really one of the things that we're talking about in our community right now. To make things even more complicated, in most of our residents' minds, there's really no differentiation between the city of Boulder and the county of Boulder, particularly in terms of the way that the land is managed. A trail is a trail is a trail, but there are actually profound differences in terms of how those are managed. And then beyond that, we also have federal land management, which in the recent transition in our federal system remains now a big question mark in terms of how progressive those activities might be in the future, and what responsibility the city and the county might have to assume some of those management responsibilities. So this is awfully hard to see. This gray block in the middle is actually the urbanized area, and you can see the green all around, some of the brown, and some of this gray. Those are all areas under conservation. So again, having made significant investments in those acquisitions over the last several decades, we're now challenged with a hyper expensive real estate market. The median single family home price having now exceeded $1 million for the first time, increasing 15 to 20% annually for the last 3 or 4 years. Where that gets us is actually in the last bullet point here, changes in cultural values around preservation and the need to provide affordable housing and some of the solution sets that might come from that. These are the 4 challenges we identified to biodiversity in particular. Nothing new here, you've heard some of this before, but in the context of the Rocky Mountain West, changes in water availability in particular is extraordinarily, almost existential for our community. Boulder is quite privileged in that very early on we acquired the source of we acquired our watershed. So we do have more active management and flexibility in our systems than many of our neighbors. But the reality of it is that regardless of how active our management is, 2 years of drought represents a profound threat to our community, let alone the biodiversity. The water availability is then compounded by some challenges around timing. Most of our precipitation falls as snow and sits in the mountains and then very conveniently melts during the course of the hottest months and provides a fairly steady amount of water to the system. And this is a highly adapted system to that environment. You have, again, sort of these major ecological transitions and changes, even very small changes that we're seeing right now are absolutely devastating for the sequencing of pollinators, predator-prey relationships. Invasive species and pests has been mentioned in a couple other contexts here. We have one in particular that we're very concerned with, is really influencing our urban canopy master planning process, urban forest canopy master planning process. It's the emerald ash borer. It's a tiny little invasive. It will devastate about 20 to 30% of our urban canopy. It's a 100% mortality within the next 10 years. So that does obviously have its repercussions for human health, for urban heat island, a whole host of other issues. And the real challenge that we're facing there, of course, is not only just sort of wrapping our mind around that problem, but how to integrate those impacts into other master planning processes. We have a very progressive zero carbon emissions goal by 2030, and then how is that going to impact the heating and cooling loads, those sort of things. We also, I should say that while much of this land is in just strict conservation, much of it, some portion of it is in agricultural production. That is something of a historical value. We are looking at increasing intensity of use of those lands over time, and then changes in cultural values around preservation, as I mentioned. Some of our current approaches, not super easy to see. Boulder, apparently much like Semarang, is a city of planners. We have plans upon plans upon plans. We've added our resilience strategy to that pile back in April. And I'll tell you about what we have planned for that in a moment. But beyond our planning process, and again, very progressive in the sense that we have made major investments over decades in terms of conservation, but we also have made investments in terms of greenways, dual and tri-use greenways for recreation, flooding, and ecosystem preservation. That's the one that's kind of washed out there, number 2. We've also begun to make some very interesting investments at the city level around new staff hires that are specifically oriented to some of these challenges. Pollinator preservation and decline is a tremendously important one. It hasn't come up here yet, but it is something that I know is a global challenge. So having a person who is really the point person for that issue in our community has paid some very important dividends in terms of public outreach. Similarly, we have a really profound urban wildlife issue, which includes, I should say, mountain lions, which, it's not a trivial thing. And so having somebody who's really thinking about that has now given us, as the resilience team, some capacity to think about mapping those interactions and really understanding the patterns as pressures, ecological pressures are forcing some of these interactions to become more profound and violent. And then finally, one of the things that we are struggling with, but kind of associated with the pollinator preservation in particular, is fairly stringent restrictions on pesticide application. So the city, as an organization, has taken the lead and has restricted pesticide use to very specific iconic trees, things that the community would feel quite the loss of. And then beyond that, there is a full prohibition. I should also put in here, actually, I have a community-driven effort, because we are really, again, from the resilience perspective, it's not just a city-run initiative. We really do include the community. One of these is autonomously derived. It's this Bee Safe Neighborhoods, and I don't know if anyone has heard of this, but this is 15 contiguous households agree to plant only native bee-friendly trees with no pesticide use, no acquisition of anything that's been used with a pesticide. And it is, we have 3 or 4 of these neighborhoods within our community right now. A little bit easier to see. So 3 strategy actions that are directly relevant to what we're talking about here today, although some of the others you can sort of contort and get into this space as well. The most important one, going backwards as it turns out, action 3.5 from our strategy is managing thriving ecosystems. And what this really gets to is, I think, the nut of what we're here about today is this abundance of plans, this really interesting motivation for coordinated action, and what does that actually represent? I mean, we will have to produce another plan, certainly, but how does this plan then have those resilience dividends where you're getting $3 for every dollar spent, or coordinating actions that haven't been coordinated before? The second action here is ensuring that the resilience of our local food system. As I mentioned, we do have a lot of lands in agricultural production right now, but we don't understand is really what is our vulnerability to perturbations and disturbances in the global or regional food system, and how can Boulder's agricultural production then buffer those future disruptions. So that has really profound implications on water availability, the intensity of pesticide use potentially, or agricultural additives. So that's a really interesting conversation that we're just getting started with, and I'm really interested to see where that takes us here. And then finally, this is really, having been in a community that has valued preservation and conservation for so long, what has happened seemingly in the last couple of years is that it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. That we're not in the acquisition mode anymore. We're moving more towards what are the next level of policy implications, and how do we bring the community along? How do they own this in a new and totally different way than they have before? And so we're launching a major new initiative around citizen science, which has a climate component. But that will actually be launching this April, and it is sort of a wildlife inventory project, which is very exciting. And I think it's got that kind of warm, fuzzy critter feel to it, but it's really just the tip of the spear and where we want to go in terms of understanding carbon sequestration and some water quality issues, and have people really own the collection of that data, be data champions for the sort of tough actions that are going to have to come from that. There we are. And last but not least, by any stretch, is Jeff Guibert.